This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with copies of the game provided by COM8 COM1. Before the announcement and subsequent release of R-Type Final 2, it was thought that R-Type, as a shooting game at least, had come to an end. Sure, a couple of strategy titles, a number of retro ports on various platforms, and enhanced versions of the originals such as R-Type Dimensions kept the name alive, but R-Type Final was indeed the final original entry the shooting series would see for some 17 years. In this time frame, a number of love letters to IRM's flagship series would see release in interesting places from a number of independent developers. But none have really come close to what COM8 COM1 has done with Rigid Force. This was a game that did really cool things with the basic R-Type setup, adding a few wrinkles and bringing the presentation of it all to the 21st century with a robust graphics engine. And in some ways, it outshines R-Type's most recent final entry.
Entering combat mode.
Rigid Force was developed by COM8 COM1 and saw release as Rigid Force Alpha on Windows PC in August 2018. It would then make its way to home consoles as Rigid Force Redux, first on Switch and Xbox One in June 2020, then on PlayStation 4 later in December the same year. Rigid Force Redux changed a number of things from Alpha, the biggest of which was a switch to a new engine. At a glance, this game screams R-Type, but it also takes inspiration from other places as well, all while having several unique bits and pieces going for it. Let's take a closer look. As much as Rigid Force takes inspiration from R-Type, its gameplay is considerably different in a number of ways. Its movement, for example, is comparatively swift, allowing players to traverse the screen in an expeditious manner. Rigid Force also features true analog control, allowing players to fine-tune their movement speed based on stick tilt. Of course, traditional Hard 8 all-or-nothing digital control is also available through the D-pad on any controller the player may be using. Like R-Type, Rigid Force starts the player out with a basic attack that can be changed by collecting one of 3 special weapon pickups. All of them are considerably different than the R9's lasers and wave cannon. A blue icon will equip the player with a fast-firing linear laser. An orange icon will change the player's weapon to a slower-firing spread-style gun. And the green icon will allow players to fire a reflective shot that bounces off the top and bottom of the screen, as well as any other surfaces they impact. All 3 are useful in their own right, but players should be able to make decent progress with any of them when they find one that works best for their playstyle. A number of missile sub-weapons can also be found which add a decent amount of firepower to the mix. Missiles can often do a great job of hitting enemies at extreme angles or taking out tougher to kill terrestrial enemies depending on the ones equipped. Collecting weapon or missile items of the same type will increase their power, to a maximum of 4 levels for the player's main weapon and a maximum of 2 for missiles. Rather than a charge shot, any of these attacks can be overdriven, allowing the player to deal extensive damage in very little time, at will. This overdrive is dependent on a gauge at the bottom of the screen, which is filled by green energy bits left behind by destroyed enemies. At any time, players can efficiently draw this energy in with the press of a button, which can also slow their rate of movement in the process. Finally, the Rigid Force has a short-range energy blade that can be used to clear enemy shots in a pinch, though this uses a considerable amount of energy in very little time. We don't use it very often, if at all. All neat, but Rigid Force's most striking feature is its take on R-Type's Force. Collecting weapon pickups does not summon a Force-type bit. Rather, Rigid Force requires players to collect Force shards one at a time to build it up to full power. As more are collected, the player's firepower will be amplified, but there's more to this Force than meets the eye. Players can use the shoulder buttons on their controller to shift the formation of these shards to one of 4 positions. In doing so, the player's fire will also shift around their ship, allowing for a decent degree of flexibility versus pretty much any enemy in the game. In a lot of ways, it's as if R-Type's Force was crossed with Gradius's formation-style options. Since these pieces are indestructible, they also double as defensive bits, with various positions offering the player protection against most enemy fire. Since this Force isn't launched, players are able to very efficiently attack and defend against any threat anywhere on the screen without being left completely open as they would in R-Type. Yet another feature that sets Rigid Force apart from R-Type is the player's life gauge. Players will have various amounts of health depending on the difficulty chosen. 3 hit points on easy, 2 on medium, and just 1 on hard. This life gauge will recharge at the end of each segment, meaning that if the player sustains damage in the main phase, their life will be refilled during the boss, then the next stage, and so forth. All of these features make Rigid Force quite a different experience than R-Type in the end, but a refreshing one to be sure. More importantly though, they allow players of any skill level to enjoy the game and even work towards a very manageable yet challenging 1cc, all while maintaining a fair and balanced difficulty overall. Played over the course of 6 decently sized stages, each separated with an often challenging boss encounter, Rigid Force lasts an adequate amount of time. Not too long, yet not too short. For those that need a helping hand, limited continues are available if the player loses all of their lives. More continues are earned as the game is played more. It also offers the player alternate endings depending on the difficulty cleared, adding a little replay to the mix. But that's not all. Each cleared stage can be taken on in arcade mode, complete with additional score mechanics and clear indicators for every difficulty. The only downside is that arcade mode is only able to be taken on one stage at a time, rather than in a full run manner. An unlockable boss rush mode can also be accessed when the game is beaten on any difficulty, adding even more to play. Basically, it's the most fun we've had with an R-Type alike in quite a while, and, dare we say it, even more than R-Type's most recent outing. Generally speaking, Rigid Force's scoring is basic. Simply destroying enemies and collecting energy increases the player's score. There are no stage-end bonuses and little in the way of dedicated mechanics in the main game. Not to mention there is no extend score, relying instead on difficult-to-reach one-up items. This more or less means that the bulk of Rigid Force is a survival-type shooter. In arcade, though, additional factors make for a much more engaging time when playing for score. A multiplier can be built up by collecting energy, which can be grown to a maximum of 128 times. When no energy is being collected, the multiplier gauge will deplete and its value will fall to lower levels. This alone does a great job of boosting up the player's score if achieved. While no bosses are fought in this mode, players do get tallies and bonuses which are added to the player's achieved score for a stage end total. Destroying strategically placed bombs, rescuing astronauts, destroying as many enemy waves as possible, getting as high a multiplier as possible, and losing as few lives as the player can, are all taken into consideration in this regard. The player is then awarded a medal based on their performance. It really makes us wish an arcade full run would be available complete with bosses. It would make for a much more competitive scoring mode, especially since Rigid Force also features online leaderboards. Still, while limited, what's here should extend the amount of replay players have with Rigid Force if scoring is something important to them, as it is to us, even though the main campaign is limited in this regard. It should come as no surprise that Rigid Force Alpha has the greatest graphical potential of all 4 available versions of the game. It can maintain a solid frame rate and performs responsively, even at maximum spec. But we've been having a hard time keeping our records from stuttering. The gameplay feels excellent though. Multiple resolutions are also supported for players of all walks of life, and with very forgiving minimum specs. We're talking i3 processors, 4GB of RAM, and GTX 700s here. Rigid Force Alpha should run fairly well with some fiddling on any rig from the last half-decade or longer ago. Rigid Force Redux on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One does take a hit in the visuals, but its performance is a lot more stable. It uses the Unity engine instead of the original AcNex A8 from the PC's Alpha, which is better optimized for its new console environment. It has more responsive control, maintains 60 frames per second, and rebalances aspects such as enemy hit points, scoring, and boss patterns. Other changes like a new anime-styled portrait for Sai, complete with a new voice, as well as an overhauled interface that's much easier to interpret at a glance further set Redux apart from Alpha. Here's the most interesting part of it all. Unlike R-Type Final 2, Rigid Force Redux does some really amazing things on Nintendo's underpowered Switch hardware. It looks almost exactly like the PlayStation 4 version of the game, save for its rougher edges. Not only does it maintain an excellent frame rate with comparatively little slowdown, it looks fantastic while it does so. Even the controls are responsive, exhibiting no noticeable input delay. This is the kind of quality we expect from a new shooting game on Switch, and it's refreshing to finally play a modern shooting game that isn't severely compromised from a visual or performance standpoint. It's so good, in fact, that in our eyes it doesn't matter whether you go with the Switch, PS4, or Xbox One version with this one. The experience will be virtually identical. There's no denying that Rigid Force has a stellar presentation, something that has been plainly evident since Alpha first hit the scene in 2018. Though Alpha does hold the edge visually, Redux is still no slouch, and again, it looks and runs fantastically on both the PlayStation 4 and the Switch. While Alpha looks stunning all around, Redux holds the edge with a better HUD and the anime-style portrait for Psy. The general enemy and stage design is pretty good too, with tons of detailed backgrounds and some excellent lighting, particularly on PC. There are even a number of Gradius-inspired enemies, like this crazy blade ship. One thing we did notice between Alpha and Redux though is how the force forms as more shards are collected. In Alpha, they come together with equidistant positions. In Redux, they are added 90 degrees at a time. We like it more in Alpha. Rigid Force has a lot of exposition for being a shooting game with only an AI companion, offering the player all kinds of information about their ship, destinations that are traveled to, boss encounters, and mission progress. Any of these fully voiced segments can be skipped, but they definitely add a layer of quality and effort seldom seen in these kinds of games. Best of all, they're kept fairly brief and don't interrupt or distract from the action on screen like in Raiden 5. Or worse, the audioless Eero Hero. Speaking of audio, Rigid Force has some fantastic chops with regards to its sound. A great synthwave soundtrack, clear, well-delivered dialogue, and well-produced, punchy sound effects make for a game that sounds just about as good as it looks. All 4 of these versions also have achievements built into them, with Alpha and the PlayStation 4 and Xbox versions of Redux offering player account achievements and trophies, while Switch is restricted to in-game only. Still a nice addition, which should add a layer of replayability to the package regardless of the version played. Generally speaking, Rigid Force is much better than we anticipated, and everyone should be checking it out. But how does it stack up? Let's take a look. Rigid Force features solid, swift control that makes it quite a bit easier to handle, especially after death, than R-Type. While it may be less difficult than the classic shooters it's inspired by, Rigid Force offers a good challenge to players of all skill types. With 6 fairly lengthy stages and extensive boss phases for each, paired with a score-heavy arcade mode and a boss rush, there's plenty to play in Rigid Force. Both the Alpha and Redux versions of Rigid Force look fantastic and feature pretty great stage and enemy design. The PC's Alpha has the best visuals overall, but a harder to see and interpret HUD, while Redux's graphics are scaled back a bit, but with better portraits and HUD elements. A solid synthwave soundtrack, good voice delivery, and great sound effects make Rigid Force a game that sounds as good as it looks. Taking heavy inspiration from classics such as R-Type and Gradius often leads to a lot of samey gameplay, but not so much in Rigid Force. Inspired, definitely, but with more than enough of its own DNA to make it stand apart. A full-run arcade mode would have been amazing though. Weighing in at about $20 US, Rigid Force Alpha and Redux have a great cost to value for the quality that they offer the player. A physical Switch version is also available in standard and collector's editions on GameFairy.io for between $30 and $50 US, which should make a very nice addition to anybody's library. Rigid Force has been a game we've been requested to cover for some time now, and I'm glad we were able to do it. This is a game that I shied away from because of the utter brutality and harsh conditions found in games like R-Type 3, R-Type Dimensions, and R-Type Delta. But in the end, this is easily the best R-Type style game I've played, and to be frank, it's more fun than the bulk of the series it takes inspiration from, with obvious exception. Third lightning and final one, I'm looking at you. But that's just me. Rigid Force Alpha and Rigid Force Redux get a 4.75 out of 5. Rigid Force is available in some form on all major platforms. Links in the description below. And that does it for Series 12 of Bullet Heaven. It was a tumultuous year for me, fraught with turmoil, controversy, and adversity, but Series 13 is going to be a much different beast. Expect huge changes and expanded coverage that aren't necessarily just reviews. We've been getting a lot of feedback, and we might just have the formula we need to get Bullet Heaven where many have claimed it should be for years. Over the summer, we'll be prototyping a number of different subformats in preparation for the series proper in September. We hope you'll join us for the biggest transformation and evolution the series has seen since Series 3. Until then, we'll see you all in the next episode.